It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to The Phil Ferguson Show. Later on today, we have an interview with someone who has recently left Christianity and a little bit about their story and their background. And hopefully you find those kinds of stories as fascinating as I do. I've got a few people lined up to do those, and I'll try to spread them out over the coming weeks and or months. Also in today's show, I'm going to do kind of a recap of target date funds. I've talked about them a few times in the past, and some of my comments have been less clear than I would desire, so I'm going to try to clear that up without making it more confusing, what I do and do not like about target date funds. So I'm going to leave that for later. Another thing, I think recently I mentioned Robinhood app that you can get on your phone. And before I touch on this next story here real quick, I want to again emphasize my standing position on all kinds of cool, new, trendy apps to buy stocks and or invest money. I am starting with the default position that I don't like it. If you can convince me that it's good or better than the conventional way of investing, I'm not opposed to it, but often there seems to be a problem when you get into the details. Again, I really went into the details on Acorns many months ago. I recently talked about Robinhood, and now Robinhood has a bit of a problem because they launched a bank. And is it a bank or isn't it a bank? And I actually had a listener ask me about it because with this bank, air quotes, bank, you can get 3% in your checking account. And they were very excited about that because their conventional bank pays nothing in their checking account and maybe a fraction of a percent in their savings account so they could make money. So, of course, one of my questions would be, how much money are you keeping in a checking account? If you're sitting on $100,000, okay, that adds up to real money because you could have $3,000 extra dollars making 3% in a year, but you shouldn't have that kind of money, in my opinion, in a savings account. You probably don't need that kind of money in a savings account. Most people don't need more than 3 to 6 months in a checking account. So even if you're spending 10 grand a month, which is a nice juicy budget for most people, that's 30,000 to 60,000, and it's fluctuating up and down. So the net effect that you're going to have is a few $100, maybe $1,000 of interest. And if you don't need that much money in the checking account, I mean, you want to have a cash reserve, you can have the cash reserve in a CD at the bank, or you could have it in a bond fund, which takes a little more risk, but you might make a little bit more. There's different ways to do this instead of just sitting on a big pile of cash. But if for some reason you wanted to have a big pile of cash, the thought was, could I have this new bank, air quotes, and checking account at Robinhood? Well, apparently now some senators are thinking about investigating this, and the SEC is involved, and people that run banks are involved because this is not really a bank. It doesn't meet the qualifications of a bank and or a checking account. So Robinhood may have been a little too loose with the terminology that they've used, and so now they're in a little bit of trouble. I don't think it's going to be really big trouble, and I think they're going to find a way to work around it. And they were coming up with this. Let's see if I can find this in the story here. They were going to change the name of it. Instead of calling it bank and checking, they were going to use a cash management program to make sure that everyone understands that it's not really a bank and it's not really a checking account as you think of it as a checking account. What's different? That's up for you to figure out. So at this time, I can't recommend putting a big pile of money to sit in Robinhood or any other app. You have to use, well, you don't have to. I recommend that you use conventional systems until you are convinced that one of these alternatives is better than the conventional system. So a little bit about that. I've also been asked by people to reassure them about the recent stock market activity. The last couple of weeks, last couple of months, the market has been down. And the day before Christmas, the Dow, which is only 30 stocks, but as well as the S&P 500, went down an additional 3% in one day. And I'm kind of going to reassure you a little bit, because if you're a long-term investor, you shouldn't worry about what happens in a day, a week, or a month. One of the things that I do, and the books that I recommend, and the plans that I outline for clients and ideas that I provide for listeners, is that you should have a plan. And that plan depends on a lot of factors, one of which is your age. So if you're 30, you should have the vast majority of your money in the stock market. What happens in any given day, week, month, or even a year should pretty much be irrelevant to you in your plans between now and retirement 20, 30, 40 years from now. So the fact that it went down shouldn't bother you. Your plan should be to save a lot of money, save money every year, every month, every week, however you've got to do it. And I think it was just last episode where I talked about big drops in the market are actually a really big advantage for someone who's new to investing. You're getting things on sale. So for anyone under 40, it's not a problem. Anyone who's more than 12 to 15 years from retirement, it's not a problem in the long run if the market goes down a lot. It's actually a deal for you because you get more years to buy in when the prices are low. This is one of the topics and one of the reasons I recently added the book, Winning the Loser's Game. It talks about that in this book. It's not a bad thing. Chillax, invest more money. Keep investing. If it keeps going down, keep investing. If it keeps going down, keep investing. Right now, we're looking at the market being down around 8, 9%. I haven't checked the actual numbers because I'm going to do that probably in the next episode after the first of the year so that I can just give you some numbers. But the numbers don't matter that much on a year-to-year basis. They definitely don't matter on a week-to-month basis, but there they are. And it's another topic in that book, Winning the Loser's Game. You can figure out to 2, 3, 4 decimal places exactly how much the market has gone up over a day or a week or a month. Does not mean that information is usable or valuable. It might be tricking you to do the wrong thing. The other thing I find quite amusing is that while the market, let's just say it's down 10% for year to date, the year's not quite over, but the previous year, the market was up 22, 23, 24%. You're still up 24% minus 10%, 14% over 2 years. Not a great return over 2 years, but not so bad. And this is, of course, a down year, it looks like, following 10 years in a row of up. So on the whole, if you're a long-term investor, you're doing really good. And the reason to have a plan is so that you are not jostled aside by your emotions. I talked about if you're far away from retirement. If you're close to retirement, you should be working on building your cushion. As a brief reminder, in January of 17, I made a small step towards slightly more conservative. In January of 18, I made an additional small step towards conservative. And over the summer of 2018, I started expressing concerns, I guess the way I should say it, about large cap and large cap growth and maybe having too much money in the stock market. And for my clients, we made some modest adjustments. We make small adjustments over time. And if the market falls 40 or 50%, it shouldn't affect people close to retirement because they have an appropriately built cushion already in place. It shouldn't affect people who are really far from retirement because you have a long time to wait for it to come back. So you have a plan. You stick to the plan. I make no promises, nor do I make any real effort to protect you from short-term market declines. That is intentional. The data shows that people that try to figure out when the market's going to go down and get out and try to figure out when the market's going to go back up and get back in. For the average person, it doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. It works quite badly because every once in a while there's a 10 or 15% correction and the market falls 10, 15% and you jump out and then it goes right back up 10 or 15% and you go, oh shit, I'm sitting in my cash still. Well, great. You ended up selling at the bottom and now to get back in, you have to buy high. So you sold low and you bought high. You just screwed yourself. And even if you're right some of the time, if you're wrong some of the time, the net effect is no win. And the net effect might be higher taxes and higher transactional costs, especially in a taxable account. So you have to be right almost all the time. Very, very few people are. So for the most investors, buy and hold. Dollar cost average. Keep investing year after year after year after year. If you're 10, 12, 15 years or less from retirement, you should start a cushion. You should build a cushion. You should have it close to being ready 4 or 5 years out is currently where my head is thinking. And some of this may change. And the further the market goes down in the short run, the more excited I am to put money into it. It's a contrarian philosophy. Why weren't more people concerned that the market had gone up 10 years in a row? Why weren't people concerned that the market went up 22% last year? Most people are giddy about that. I've had people call me and talk to me, and they show me the funds that they own, and they're all loaded up with a handful of stocks that are doing the best. Well, if something changes, if the paradigm changes for online security, online privacy, online advertising, or if you find out a company like Facebook has been taking money no matter who wants to run the ads, no matter how wrong or factually inaccurate they are, those companies can get whacked. And I think Facebook is down something like 30% in 4 or 5 months. It can happen. So you don't want too many eggs in that basket. That's why we have this wild diversification. So I'm not going to protect you from a big drop. I'm not going to try to protect you from a big drop. If you're a younger investor, you want to maximize the returns in the long run by owning stocks through index funds. That's just how it works. Anyway, a couple other quick things. It looks like I'm going to start running ads for the show. And I'm still conflicted about this, but I'm leaning towards it, and it's probably just going to happen because there's money to be picked up that is just sitting there. And I don't know. So I'm working with the podcast hosting company, Spreaker, to see what kind of control I have over the advertisements. My fantasy is that no financial products get advertised on the show. I don't know that they can guarantee me that. And it may also be wherever you are when you download the shows, because when I downloaded some podcasts when I was in Italy, I got Italian commercials. It's fascinating, the algorithms that these companies use to figure out what ads to give you. It may not be something that I have any control over. The other thing that might worry me is religious ads, but quite frankly, if the Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses want to pay for an ad on my channel, I'm going to take their fucking money. And maybe that's how I should look at annuities, hoping that you know not to buy the shit that comes up on a random ad. So, and because of that, I had a lot of people say, if you're going to do ads, that's cool, and I respect you doing ads, because I would pick up the money myself, you've got to create a Patreon page. Well, I've done that. I already have two people that have joined as Patreons. Thank you very much for doing that. If you would like to do the same thing, you can go to patreon.com/Phil, Phil, really short and simple. You can find the page. There's a couple different levels there. And because of that, and because of the ads, I had to work with my attorneys and the companies that help me do my regulations and filing. And I'm tightening up the screws a little bit on some disclaimers. And you're going to hear my first stab at dropping a disclaimer into the show a little later on in this episode. If you think it's horrible, give me suggestions on how else I should phrase it, and maybe I can fix it, make it better. But I think it's okay. I think you'll be fine. The other one, of course, if you donate money at Patreon, I had to be really clear, and it's in the disclaimer, and I also put it on the page at Patreon, that when you donate through Patreon, when you contribute through Patreon, whatever the right word is, I'm not 100% sure, we are not establishing a client relationship, you and I, the donor and Phil. There is no relationship there. I'm not getting paid to give you advice. You are simply donating to support the content of the show, because it takes time for me to do this and put it all together. And part of me was even thinking, maybe I could do the show every other week. Maybe I could do the show once a month. But I like doing it, but it takes a lot of time. So if it's bringing in money, at least kind of in my head, that justifies the time spent on it. But I also did it for free on purpose. So I don't know. I'm conflicted about that. So probably what I'm going to do is some kind of fundraiser match with the first couple of months. I'm not sure. I haven't worked out the details. I've got some ideas. I'll announce that when those form up. But if you want to get the show without ads, you can get that at Patreon. At this point in time, I'm not promising anything else, even if you join at a higher level. The whole idea is that if you can only afford $1, pay $1, you skip the line, I guess, you get ad-free show. That's cool. You get to say you like it. You get to contribute $1. There's a couple other levels. Maybe I can give something away or some advantage. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how that works yet. I'm still getting my feet under me, my legs under me on how to use Patreon. So if you have great suggestions, let me know. You can send me emails, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com, and I'll see what I can do. Of course, keep in mind, I have to not do something that's going to get me in trouble with regulators and my attorneys and my registration advisors that have opinions on what I'm allowed to do and what I'm not allowed to do. And I pay them really good money to protect me. So just think about that. Let me know what you think, what your thoughts are, and we'll get on with the rest of the show.
The Pope, discussing the existence of God with an out-and-out atheist, starts off very correctly, discussion, and as the hours go by, it gets more and more heated, and eventually the Pope turns to the man and he said, "The mom! Get the mom! And you, come here. You are like a man who is totally blindfolded in a dark room looking for a black cat that is not there." The fellow said, "With all respect, Your Holiness, I think there's great similarity between us both." He said, "What do you mean, similarity?" He said, "Well, as far as I'm concerned, you are like a man who is blindfolded in a totally dark room looking for a black cat that isn't there. The only difference is that you found it."
I recently had a listener contact me and ask me if I would take a look at their 401k for their work. And so I had them send me what is a list of all the funds that are available. And this should be something that you can get if you have a 401k or a 403b or something like that, deferred comp. And that gives you all the investment options that you have available to you. And I went through their entire list and I came back to them and I said, you should invest in the Vanguard Target Date Fund, I don't know, 2045, 2030, whatever the appropriate year for them was. And they said, well, wait a minute, Phil, I listened to your show, and you always say that target date funds are bad. And this made me kind of sad because I was not able to articulate my thoughts on this correctly or well enough to the point that this listener understood what I was trying to convey. So I want to start out by saying target date funds are not bad. They're not great either. But in this person's case, given the other choices that were available to them, it was the best choice that you could get. So I have some issues with target date funds, and it's something that from time to time I feel compelled to talk to because they're a really big deal. Just like index funds have grown and grown dramatically in the marketplace, target date funds have grown, and for some good reasons, they're very, very popular. But there's some things that aren't great about them. It doesn't mean that they're bad and that you should avoid them at all costs and put your money in something else. It means you need to understand what you're investing in. So let me give you a few examples of some concerns that I have. I just built on my screen here from the Vanguard website, the Vanguard Target Retirement Fund 2065. To my knowledge, this is the farthest out you can go at this time. So this is 47 years from now. So this would be someone who's very, very brand new to investing, just beginning. And this fund only opened up slightly over a year ago, July 12th of 2017. So it doesn't have a historical track record of performance. However, you could very easily calculate what that would have been by looking at what is in the fund, because at Vanguard, the target date funds are a mixture of other Vanguard index funds, which is really kind of cool when you think about it. But this is for someone who's going to retire a long time from now, and they're probably just getting started. So you would imagine that the vast majority, or in my position, all of the money is in stocks, but it's not. 10% is in bonds. Now, bonds are not bad at all. They have their place. They may not, in my humble opinion, have a place in the portfolio of a 30-year-old or a 22-year-old, someone who's using the 2065 fund, because those bonds are pulling down your long-term performance. So if the stocks make a 10% theoretical long-term return, and a 100 and even 200 years of data for the U.S. market and international markets suggest this is likely to be the case based on historical data. You can go look up since 1970 on the Wikipedia page for S&P 500 that it's been over 10%. Will it be that way going in the future? No idea. I have no reason to believe it's going to be anything different than the historical norms. But maybe it's a little less, maybe it's a little more, give or take 10%. Bonds, collectively as a group, are going to basically return the amount of dividends that they pay minus defaults, plus or minus changes in interest rates, because interest rates affect the value of the bonds that you already own going forward. So the question is, what are the bond funds that this index is using? Well, it has two bond funds. 7% is in the Vanguard Total Bond Market Index, and 3% is in the Vanguard Total International Bond Index. So you have some exposure, 70-30, in domestic bonds and international bonds. And so the question is, what are the rates of yield for these bond funds? Well, current yields are pretty darn low. The international fund, at least as shown on the Vanguard website, is 1.04%. And on the domestic international, or the domestic total bond fund, it's 3.24%. So on the whole, you're going to make 2.5%, 3%. And these are mostly short term. These are mostly conservative bonds. But the total U.S. bond fund does have in a mix of longer term bonds and some junk bonds, just to round it out. It has about 15% of the bonds are BAA or BBB rated, which is just above junk. So I guess it doesn't have any junk, but it does have long-term bonds, 10 years, 20 years and older. Not too many. So it's a relatively conservative fund, which is why it's making 3.24% yield. If interest rates go up, that yield, you could get the 3.24%, and the value of the fund could fall 3 or 4%. So your net for that year might be closer to zero if interest rates go up. If interest rates were to go down, which I don't see happening in the short run, you could make 3% and a few percent points more if interest rates go down. So in the long run, you're going to make 2.5%, 3% on this part of that target date portfolio. So if 90% of your money makes 10 theoretically, and 10% of your money makes 3 theoretically, your combined overall return is not going to be around 10%. it is more likely going to be around 9.3%. So you're losing 0.7%. And you're thinking to yourself, well, losing 0.7% is not that big of a deal. And in a given year, it's not that big of a deal. But if you compound that over time, it can result in a loss to you as a long-term investor of thousands, tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the size of your portfolio. And I think that that is a reduction that you need not take. So this is one of the problems I have with a long-term investment in a target date fund, such as the ones by Vanguard, and many other firms have the similar problem. So I would prefer that you had 100% of your money in stocks. So if you have in your 401k an investment like the total stock market index or the S&P 500, or what they often call the Vanguard Institutional Index, which is the S&P 500, or even Vanguard's Total World Index, which has U.S. and international in it, I would prefer that if you are 25 or 30. But this person came to me, did not have those options. They had a whole bunch of managed funds from companies like John Hancock, American Funds, and a bunch of other names. And they all have expense ratios of 0.5, 0.7, 1%. Sometimes people will show me 401ks where they have funds that have 2% expense ratios. Absolutely ridiculous. And so that effect is going to be bigger on your return than these 0.7 that you're losing by having some of your money in bonds. And of course, if the market does go down, you won't lose as much in the short run as someone in an all stock fund, because 10% is in bonds. Why Vanguard does this, I'm not 100% sure. I'm probably guessing that they want to show you the diversity of the portfolio, and they want you to experience a little bit less of a decline if the market falls, and so you're more likely to stick with it. Well, I want you to embrace the reality of stock market volatility and realize that the single best way of getting rid of stock market volatility in the long run is not bonds. In the long run, it's time. Time reduces stock market volatility. And on a previous episode, we talked about how being young and adding money reduces stock market volatility. So there's all kinds of different ways that you can handle this volatility. One of them is with bonds. That's a wonderful fix if you're close to retirement or in retirement, or you might need money in a few years. As an example, sometimes people will contact me and say, hey, Phil, I've got this $30,000 inheritance that I want to set aside to buy a house in 4 or 5 years. Where can I invest that to make a lot of money? Well, where can you invest it that you can afford to lose half? And they're like, well, it's for a house, so I need the $30,000. Well, you just limited your options a whole lot. In that case, maybe in your bank is fine. In a CD making 2 or 3% is fine. A short-term bonds making 3.5% is fine. Putting it in the stock market where you can theoretically make 10, but you could theoretically lose half in a very short period of time is not a good option, because making a bunch of money, while that would be cool, doesn't change the likelihood that you're going to buy a house based on your description, but losing half the money now makes it where you can't buy the house. So the downside effects are worse than the upside benefits. So for short-term money, you want to have protection. For retirement money, you want to have a part of your portfolio in protection. And these funds, they do gradually increase the amount that's held in what I would call the cushion. So let's look at the 2020 fund, shall we? That's really just around the corner. Let's take a look at that one. In the 2020 fund, we have 32% in the total stock market index, meaning the United States, and 21.2% in international stocks. So 53.2% of your money is in stocks. So 53% is in stocks. About 47% is in bonds, and it has the total bond index. Again, that's U.S. at about 29%, international bonds at 12.5%, and short-term inflation protected bonds at 5.6%, which the short-term protected are going to make less. So again, if the other portfolio, the bonds are making 3% in this portfolio, your bonds are maybe making 2 or 2.5. So your expected long-term return is not 10. It's not even 9.3. It's going to be much closer to, so let's say, 6.3, 6.5% per year. Again, on average. Now, the nice thing about having so much in bonds is that if the market falls 50%, hopefully that's some kind of worst case scenario in a calendar year, 50%, if half of your money is in bonds and they make 3%, you would lose something like 25, but you have the 3% from the bonds. So maybe something like 21, 22%. So that's cool. I mean, if you're in retirement and the market goes down by half and you only lose 25%, that's fantastic. That's why you want all the bonds. But we have another big problem here is, what if half of your money in bonds is not the right number for you? And how do you know? Well, for me, it's not the percentage that's important. It's how long you can live on the portfolio without selling the stocks. So I don't design the cushion based on a percentage, and it makes it complicated for me to give a general guideline. If I gave a general guideline, it would be that if you're very aggressive, 30% in bonds at full retirement, most people 40% plus or minus. If you want to be really conservative, like this fund from Vanguard, half of your money in bonds. However, there are people, like my dad was an example for this, is that he had 10% of his money in the cushion at the time of his death at 81. Why did he do that? Because he was living way below his means, and his portfolio was a generous size in comparison to the amount of money that he took out every year. He also had multiple sources of income. He had Social Security. That's very conservative and safe. His wife, my mom, also had Social Security, about half of his, also very conservative and safe. And he also had 2 pensions, which you may not have access to pensions. They're much less likely today than they were 10 years ago or 30 years ago. So he had a lot of money coming in on a regular basis, no matter what. He lived well below what he could have lived on, which we encouraged both of my parents to spend more money. They didn't. That resulted in a bigger portfolio going to me and my brothers, which, yay us, but I would have rather they spent more of it and enjoyed it while they could. But they could have a very risky portfolio knowing that they don't need most of it, that they're not going to spend most of it, and having a smaller cushion. So if that's the kind of lifestyle that you live, a 10% cushion might be all you need, but it might be 20 or 25%. If you need every penny out of your portfolio every year, having half in bonds might not be a bad idea. So, I mean, it gives you the range, but that's a pretty big freaking range. And if you use this one fund, you get what they give you, whether you want it or not. And so it's hard for you to adjust. That's one of the reasons I don't like it. But if you're close to retirement and you have a 401k and all your money's in a 401k, putting it in a fund like this, the 2020 fund, might not be a bad idea. Okay, maybe you want to take a little more risk. You go to the 2025 fund or the 2030 fund, and it has a little bit less in bonds. But then the next big problem comes in that when you add money to this mix. You don't get to take advantage of one of the things that I love, which is this regression to the mean idea, where things that have underperformed, at least when you look at large segments, large parts of the U.S. market, like large cap growth versus small cap value. This does not apply to individual stocks. If a stock has been doing poorly for the last 3 years, does not in any way give you any valuable information at all, again, in my opinion, and you're listening to my show, to what's going to happen in the future. That's completely meaningless. But if you look at the small cap value index versus the large cap growth index, if one has beaten the average for 3 or 4 or 5 years and beaten it mightily, it now indicates that it's less likely to do so going forward. And so you can start to decrease the weighting of that and increasing the weighting of something that has underperformed because now it has an increased probability of doing better. Not necessarily beating the average or beating the other segments, but doing better than it's been doing. That's the regression to the mean idea. And the data shows that that works. So you can do that if you break out your U.S. investments into 6 different positions. You can't do that with a target date fund. So that's one thing where I think you're missing out, which is why target date funds aren't the best. But the other thing that really, really bugs me in retirement, a target date fund does become painfully bad. And it goes back to what I was talking about just a minute ago. If the market falls 50% and you're half in bonds and your portfolio only falls 25%, it's fantastic to only lose 25 when the market loses 50. But if you need to take money out because you're in retirement, that's the purpose of this money, is for your retirement. If you need to take money out, you don't get to pick and choose what part is being sold. You take out money at a loss of 25%. You are locking that loss in for perpetuity, and you're losing some of the advantage that you have if you instead owned half your money in the Vanguard World Index and half of your money in the total bond index, and all stocks went down 50%, that part of your portfolio would lose 50%. The bond part of your portfolio, let's pretend it made 3. Okay, and $1 million portfolio, 500,000 went up by 3%. Okay, so you made $15,000. The 500,000 that's in stock that went down 50%, you lost $250,000. The net return on your portfolio is still the same. You're down a whole lot, but you can sell some of the bonds, and you don't have to touch the stocks, and you can wait for the stocks to have good years after the bad, just like we had in 08. And again, recently talked about this. The stock market went up 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and all the way until 18. So 10 years in a row, the stock market went up. You had plenty of time for all those stocks to come back and even double what you had at the start of 18. And somewhere along the way, you could refill the cushion. So you allow the stocks time to grow, and you sell the bonds that made only 3%. And making only 3% sounds awful compared to making 10, but making 3% sounds fantastic when the stocks lose 50%. So you lose that ability to granularly adjust, which may add 1%, 0.5%, 1.5% to your portfolio through rebalancing. But you definitely lose 100% of the ability to pick and choose the individual things that you sell. And that could have a much more profound effect on your long-term performance in retirement. It also can have that same effect when you're adding money, but it's not as dramatic because when you're adding money, the total value of your portfolio is less important than the money that you're adding. It's still important and it's still valuable. And these are things that cause me concern with target date funds. But overall, they're nice. They're kind of managed. And this kind of goes a lot with robo-advisors. It'll calculate a portfolio that you should use, but with a robo-advisor, you might be able to buy and sell individual parts of it. In a target date fund, you're locked in. So some thoughts on target date funds, some of the concerns and problems with target date funds, but I probably didn't say enough. The nice thing about this is that it's very easy. And easy is good. Easy is something that your company can recommend. Easy is something that your employer might say, we start you with a target date fund based on when you will retire at the age of 65. And a Vanguard target date fund might, in many cases, be better than the other funds that are recommended to you. It might be better than you going, I'm just going to randomly pick 5 funds and put my money in it. It's definitely going to be better than you being a 30-year-old going, oh my God, I'm scared of the stock market. I put all my money in bonds. If that was your other option, or that was the thing that you were thinking because you don't understand yet how the markets work, a target date fund is wildly better for you than doing something stupid. So it's this little nuance about one of the things that I help people do is not doing really stupid things, because taking those big gambles or trying something new or trying something hot or trendy, or you got this great idea of a thing that you can invest in, that's some of the stuff that can really mess you up. You don't want to do stupid things. You want to do reasonably good things. But then we can get down into the detail and really fine tune and tweak out 0.5% or 1.5%. Or if you can pick and choose what you sell, it might be a several percent difference over the long run. So you end up making more money with your money, and sometimes you can make more money while having less overall risk. That's some information about target date funds. If I've only just confused the shit out of you, send me an email. My apologies. I'm hoping I'd be clear, but when you have a lot of people listening, someone didn't understand, and that's fine. Email me, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. If you have a 401k with a bunch of money in it and you're not sure you're doing the right thing, email me. Please confirm that you have the right email. Make sure I give you a response. Do not send statements straight off. And you probably don't even need to send your statement. You can just send me a list of what's available. I will try to find the time to look at that. I'm going to wrap up. I'm really going to finish. Finally, that's the end of target date funds for now. If you have questions, let me know. The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Your investment should be based on your situation, and you should consult with your financial advisor before taking any action. The show may contain ads. These ads are placed into the show by the hosting company after I finish recording and editing. I have little control over the content of the ads, and you should not assume that I support their products or claims. If you choose to support the show via the new Patreon page, that support does not create an advisor-client relationship. All right, everybody, welcome back. You are still listening to the Phil Ferguson Show. With me today, I have James Van Heel. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Phil.
And you are one of many people that volunteered to be on the show to kind of talk about your experiences in religion and maybe a little bit about how you got out. So let's jump in the Wayback Machine and go back to when you were a kid and you just grew up learning about the world, right? No one told you about religion, or did they?
Yeah, so I was raised Mormon, and now there are a lot of outlets for ex-Mormons to tell their stories. There weren't so many in the past. I certainly didn't grow up hearing about many, if any, ex-Mormons. But I was born what they call born in the covenant, which, saying it out loud sounds kind of creepy, but it's really just more of a clerical sort of a note to say that someone was born with both parents having been married in the temple, or as Mormons call it, sealed. So both of my parents, though they weren't born in the church or born in the covenant, they were both converts who had been converted by missionaries, and both joined and then got married in the temple. And so I was born to them and therefore born in the covenant. When Mormons get married in the temple, they're sealed for time and all eternity. So if your parents are already married and sealed and you're born to them, then you are automatically sealed to them for eternity. It's a big deal in Mormonism because it's all about having these sealings done, these connections made for eternity so that you can spend eternity with your family. And if you don't go through the proper sealing mechanisms, you will not be with your family forever.
I see. Now, you said they were, let me back up to your parents, if I may. They were both converted. Were they Americans and they lived in the United States, or were they in different parts of the world?
They were both Americans. They lived in different parts of the United States. So my mother is from a small Italian town in Pennsylvania called Meadville, and my dad is from Minnesota, which is where I grew up. And he was from a city called Golden Valley. It's a suburb of Minneapolis. So both of them were raised Catholic, and my mother was actually converted by missionaries.
Wow, so it can happen.
It can happen. It happens surprisingly often, but less and less frequently. Not to jump right up to present, but nowadays they're having fewer and fewer missionaries out in the field, and the growth is definitely not what at one point in time they advertised it to be. So that's certainly disconcerting for them.
So your parents both, at some way, somehow got converted into Mormonism. They got married in the temple. You were born, and of course, by birth, you achieved this magical level of Mormonism. And I assumed, as a fine young gentleman, you grew up and learned about the church and all it stands for. How'd that go? Was that pretty nice in general?
Overall, very, very broad picture. I mean, there are obviously a lot of good things. Like, a lot of churches can proclaim that they offer, a strong moral foundation, character, and community. Obviously, community is a huge part of why so many people stay in religion. And of course, that was no different for me. I had really strong friendships with the people that I grew up with in church. It's funny that you say, again, coming back to that born in the covenant thing, that's a huge deal. When you're born into the church, that what we were always told, especially in some of our larger youth meetings where, they outside of church and in broader geographical areas, they'd gather all of the youth together in what they call firesides, or in, special youth activities for the whole area in Minnesota where I grew up. And you're always told that being born into the church meant that you were a valiant spirit in the pre-existence. Not to get totally into the background of Mormon theology, but the idea is all of us existed pre-mortally in a pre-earth life and lived with Heavenly Father. And more or less, just to cut straight to the chase, we either decided to go with Heavenly Father's plan and come to earth to try and get a body so that we could live under his ways, or you chose to follow Satan and the lost third host of heaven. So to come to earth means that you chose to come here. But to be born into a family that was already Mormon, so you didn't have to search to find the truth, was a certain badge of honor almost to wear, to say that you must have done something special in the pre-earth life to warrant being born into a family that was already part of the church, so you didn't have to struggle to find it like so many people do.
Well, talk about a religion making you feel extra special for just being fucking dumb luck born into that religion. That sounds like a beautiful
it's
bullshit
really
story.
And it makes you feel so good. I mean, which is obviously the idea, right? Well, maybe not the intended idea, but, evolutionarily in an organization, any sort of doctrine that makes you feel super special for just by dumb luck having ended up in it and makes you feel really special is going to be successful.
Now,
who doesn't like being flattered?
Sure. When you were a kid, what percentage of the population of the entire United States did you think was Mormon?
Oh my gosh. How many did I think? Or what's the reality?
No. I have a pretty good idea.
I think it was very small.
Okay.
Even right now, which I don't think is that much different from the percentage that it probably would have been, maybe slightly less, but who really cares when you're talking about 0.1% of the entire population? Well, I guess you were saying of the U.S., right?
Yeah.
I mean, of the world, we're talking maybe 1 to 0.2%, marginally more for the United States.
Okay, because I have run into Mormons and former Mormons that have told me they thought half of the United States was Mormon.
Wow. Now, I would have to imagine that they came from what we call the Morador, the Mormon corridor of Utah, Arizona, California.
They were all
Idaho.
All of those people were from or around the state of Utah, but I have met some former Mormons, I call them, that remember being a kid and thinking that like virtually everybody is Mormon.
That plays a really interesting part, later on, especially when I went out to school in Utah, is having that huge drastic change in perception of the world. Because growing up in Minneapolis, we were definitely the salt of the earth. It's like
right.
that idea of you're the few amongst the many kind of an idea. We definitely had Minneapolis and St. Paul and that Minnesota in the surrounding Twin Cities metro area has a pretty strong base of members. So I always felt like I had a really strong structure of the church around me. But when I went off to school, I happened to be the only Mormon in my grade, and usually in the school I was attending. There maybe were 3 total spread out between grades, and I didn't really know them very well because they happened to go to a different congregation than I did.
Sure. When you say school, you're meaning like elementary, junior high, high school?
Exactly, yeah.
So there weren't enough Mormons, I guess, or at least not enough money, or they hadn't got around to making Mormon schools. You went to the public school.
As far as I'm aware, there are no Mormon secondary schools.
I'm delighted to hear that. Yeah. And you survived that, and you were a Mormon all through high school, and then did you go off to college somewhere? Where did you go?
Yeah, so I did end up going to Brigham Young University. Growing up Mormon, especially when you're outside of that Mormon corridor, when you're out amongst the tares, so to speak.
Yeah.
And you're the wheat amongst the tares. It's always that idea of, if you have good enough grades to get into BYU, because it is a fairly strong academic school, that you are going to go to BYU. It was the only school to which I applied. And actually, I would say that being in junior high and high school and being the only Mormon that I ever knew in terms of when I was at school versus when I was at church, that only strengthened that idea for me.
Well, I could see that, all of us as humans want to be around people like us, and you're told you're the super special one and there's no one else around like you, but there is this magical place that's called BYU, Brigham Young University, and you got accepted. And now, before you went or after you went, did you ever do did you do mission work? Did you go 2 years somewhere?
I didn't. The thing is, for me, I was such a strong believer through my youth and, through my high school years that I wouldn't have suspected it to happen. But when I went out to BYU, the drastic change socially really threw me for a loop.
How so?
So to go from being the sole member that I knew of and constantly trying to be an example to other people and teach what I knew, the truth about, Christ and his extra ministry in the Americas,
right?
And to, be the person in history class who was like, actually, the Native Americans aren't descended from Asians. They're actually ancient Jews from Israel. To go from that and then move out to BYU, where it was, I never personally met a non-Mormon at BYU. I guess they're all in all on the football team, from what I understand. But to make that transition was very interesting, because so many people took it as finally being able to revel in the fact that they weren't the minority, that now we are not only the majority, we're all there is, really didn't sit with me very well. And it was a very instant change for me. I had never been someone who before found myself hard up to find friends or make relationships with people. But when I went out to BYU, all of a sudden that stopped. And for some reason, there were a few people that I connected with, but there was just this something that kind of kept me away from all that. And that was the fact that you're either jumping in the river and going along with the current that everyone else is, or you are way up the bank and on the outside. And so when I started to have these issues where I wasn't sure that I wanted to go on a mission, and so I wasn't going to jump into a 2-year commitment away from family and spending, at the time, I'm not sure what it is now, but at that time it was a $10,000 investment that the missionary has to pay. So any Mormon missionaries that you see out in the field, those people have paid, oftentimes their parents, but in many cases, these are people who have started a savings account when they are 8 years of age, maybe younger, where a portion of their allowance when they're a kid is going into the mission fund. They're saving every day of their lives in order so that when that time comes to go on their mission, they have the money to put down to pay for it.
So you were having doubts about going on the mission. Were you having doubts about Mormonism at all during your time at BYU?
Yeah, my big thing, looking back on it and trying to really figure out what was true, the thing that primarily got to me is I had a very close friend who was having issues with drugs and other people that she was involved with. So these issues were so painful for me to watch her go through, as well as her falling away from the church. And I was having kind of my own issues with the church. And the only thing that I could think to do to help her was to pray for her. And I remember giving these fervent prayers to make sure that she ends up okay. It was the purest thing that I could think of. I wasn't asking anything for myself. All I was asking for was to help a friend that I loved. And I think as I watched that fail, that intercessory prayer was doing nothing, that the most selfless thing that I could offer wasn't doing anything. That is probably one of the primary things that really cracked the foundation that I had.
Sure.
For my faith.
Now, did you graduate from BYU?
I didn't end up graduating from BYU. I did end up leaving, which it was after 2 years. I mean, I had a lot of very other interesting experiences there. That, with all of the other issues that I was having with attending there, I had kind of my first panic attacks that I'd ever experienced, and I ended up going to the counseling center to talk to a therapist there. And while they do try very hard to have help available for people, these are still Mormons we're talking about here. So when you talk to these people about things like, oh, well, I do this really natural thing called masturbating. Maybe you've heard of it.
Yeah.
They recommend usually these group therapy sessions that you can go to with other...
A group therapy where a bunch of masturbators meet together and talk about how they shouldn't be masturbating?
I can't even believe that I agreed to go to the thing. But the fact is, at the time, I really, really wanted to get right with what I thought I was supposed to be doing at the time. And I was trying so hard. I mean, at one point, and like a ton of other religions are like this too, but where when you leave, people always want to say, well, you got lazy, you wanted to sin. And that couldn't be further from the truth. At one point while I was at BYU trying to figure everything out, I read the Book of Mormon in the span of a week. I was trying to get things down, and then trying to come clean about masturbating, and then being sent to this group therapy where exactly you have a bunch of people in a room to talk about masturbating because that's supposed to help them stop masturbating.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And looking back on it, I kind of laugh about it, and the huge issue with me is recalling the one female that was in the room. The fact that they even put her in a room full of guys who think they have problems with masturbation, really disturbs me. And I feel bad for her still thinking back on that. But that was the kind of thing that you just deal with when you commit to going to BYU.
That's amazing. So you did eventually leave. Was it because of the religion, or you just because you didn't fit, or you were losing your faith? What was the driver for you?
I think it all did come down to that. And I had finally, after the end of 2 years there, come to the conclusion that I didn't not know that the church was true. It's not that. It's that something wasn't right. And it was that the inefficacy of intercessory prayer, trying to help my friend. The fact that the harder I tried and tried and tried to be good enough for the church that I'd been raised in, and I kept falling short of that.
Right.
I realized it wasn't healthy for me. And that whatever the case might be, whatever the truth might be that's out there, this wasn't healthy for me, and I needed to step back. And so that's when I decided to step away from Brigham Young University, and I left Utah and went back to Minnesota.
Now, in the email exchange we had, you said something about you kind of wandered for 10 years. Walk us through those 10 years.
It was very interesting because, like I said, it's not something where all of a sudden I decided the church isn't true. It was just something that didn't work for me, and I could feel that there was something not right. And of course, being raised Mormon, the main thing that you're always taught is that these feelings that you're experiencing are from the Holy Ghost. When you feel good, that's the Holy Ghost testifying to you through your spirit that the church is true. So after so many years of having these really emotional experiences at church and only ever being told that this is the Spirit testifying to you that the church is true, I had always been taught that my feelings reigned supreme.
Yeah.
That even no matter what you learn in school or what worldly sciences can teach us, that the Spirit or your feelings are really the thing that matters. So having stepped away from that, I had to follow my feelings that this wasn't working for me right now. But I hadn't in any ways, the words I'd use now is falsified the church. It was something that still loomed in my mind for years, but I just knew I had to step away from it. So it was about 10 years that I spent not really seriously considering religion, just trying to figure things out on my own. And I ended up meeting my wife about 9 years ago now in 2009, 2010 time frame. And even through our relationship, I just never had any connection to the church, and I didn't feel a need to look into it too much. When we were first together, she was kind of Lutheran, kind of not, and we would go to different church services because she kind of wanted to get back in the church, and I didn't necessarily have a feeling about it. And we'd go to these Lutheran services, and it's just so hard to sit there as a Mormon because they so thoroughly debunk a lot of other Christian religions.
Yeah.
So you're sitting there and just, you want to go, what are you guys talking about? You go to a service about Christ, and it's like, well, we don't know what happened in those 3 days, between him being crucified and being resurrected. And you want to sit there and go, I'm sorry, did you miss the memo? He went and visited the Nephites and the Lamanites in the Americas.
Yeah, of course he did.
What are you talking about?
The Nephites and Lamanites that came to America on a boat.
Exactly.
Right.
On a 600 BC sailing vessel that they built with,
sticks,
a dozen people. So I had first kind of, I'm sorry, I got a little lost in there.
Yeah.
But so it wasn't until actually that I had first joined Twitter, surprisingly, of all things, that I started to kind of, search out what was on Twitter and what things interested me. And by one way or another, I started getting into these circles of ex-Mormons. And I was like, well, I definitely don't think I'm Mormon anymore, so I guess I would call myself an ex-Mormon.
I see.
And as I got into those circles, I started getting exposed to more and more things that I had never seen before or heard before, more and more podcasts. And through those lines, I ended up getting a link to something called Letter to a CES Director, or commonly now just the CES letter. CES is a church organization, or an organization under the umbrella of the church, which is the church educational system. The CES letter was written by a former member, his name is Jeremy Runnels, who started to have his own questions about the church in his early 30s and was doing a lot of reading and investigation. And as he fell away from the church, finding all of these inconsistencies and problems with it, his family members, who were really concerned about him, put him in contact with a family friend who was part of the church educational system. And the church educational system employee agrees to take a look at Jeremy's questions and answer them. And so he and Jeremy touch base, and Jeremy ends up putting together and compiling what he had intended to just be a few questions, and it turns into a 90-page thesis of sorts, where he diagrams all of the major issues dealing with the truth claims of the church, starting with the historical accuracy of the Book of Mormon and moving on to other problematic historical messiness within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This letter is received. The CES director says, "I'll get back to you. These are great questions," and never responds. Well, some time passes by. Jeremy ends up posting this letter on the ex-Mormon subreddit, and it just catches on like wildfire. And it's getting passed around through all of the social media outlets. It's on Twitter, and then I run into it. As I first found this thing, after being out of the church for almost 10 years, and I start reading it, a weight gets totally lifted off my shoulders, as I realize that the issues that he's bringing up completely falsify any truth claims that the Book of Mormon has, at least in my mind.
Yeah. So this is pretty devastating, just ripping apart the religion that is Mormonism.
It definitely was for me. The funny thing is as it's gained momentum and so many more people have heard of it, I've had discussions with some of my more liberal believing friends who have read it, and they still sit in this area of, well, I don't know, maybe there is still space for it to be true. For me, especially being as scientifically and critically minded as I am, that did it for me, at least in terms of the church is not accurately representing its history and what it claims to be, which is enormously problematic for me.
Right. So you read this.
If the church...
Go ahead.
Sorry. If the church isn't what it claims to be, then I'm not interested.
Yeah. So you become an ex-Mormon, I mean, like really committed ex-Mormon. Did you find a new religion, or were you just kind of done?
That's the thing for me, is once I found out that the Book of Mormon wasn't true, and I watched, how Jeremy Runnels lays out in the CES letter all of the issues with it, that was the method that I took and wanted to run with. So not only was I, first of all, fascinated in following all of these little trails that the CES letter led me down in terms of reading about church history and things that they never teach you about in church but are right there in the historical record or in the writings of people from those days, then I turned to the Bible and I said, well, then I have to find out if this is true or not. And I started going down all of these little rabbit holes and trying constantly, buying books on eBay and on Amazon and trying to read about the historical Jesus and who wrote the Gospels. And I'm trying to chase it down for the Bible. And as I'm realizing, and it's coming down on me, that I'm going to have to do this for every religious book that exists, that's about the time that YouTube and the atheist experience come my way. And for me, it was Matt Dillahunty who first made it clear to me that no, the burden of proof lies on the person making the claim.
Right.
And finally, after watching how many videos on YouTube, I realized that I didn't have to falsify all of these books, that it was up to them to give evidence of their claims to me.
Yeah.
And that's when
that shift in perspective is a really, really big deal, because you could be compelled to falsify hundreds and thousands of variations of religions, or you can say, you know what, we go with what we know, and until you can show me that there's something to believe beyond just your claims, I can push it all to the side and focus on reality.
Absolutely. And that was the first time that the concept of skepticism had even dawned on me.
Right.
I had always been scientifically minded, yet somehow skepticism had invaded me. Somehow skepticism had evaded me. A lot of people ask me, well, what was it growing up that really harmed you about Mormonism? Didn't you learn great values? And one thing that's always on that list for me is that going through grade school and high school and even into college, I remember having a very difficult time understanding the concept of bias. I didn't understand why would people lie outright? Because I had always been told by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, such as the, truth to be found, that people bearing testimony was a sufficient source of evidence. So the concept of bias, to me, it evaded me. I was a smart kid. Yeah. I always did very well in school, but I was always the person who was like, how do you know that kid who's telling all those stories is actually a liar? And, I took people's word for it because I was always told, and of course you read the Bible and it's with doubting Thomas, blessed are you for believing because you have seen, but even more blessed are those who believe who have not seen.
Yeah, we have a family friend who I've told some stories and I modify facts and details so that no one can figure out who it is. But up until her 40s, she had the impression that if somebody tells you something, it must be a fact, because why would a human lie? And this has caused her many, many serious dramas and traumas in her life. And finally, one day, she's like, maybe not all people are telling the truth all the time. And I'm just like, oh my God, I knew that as a kid. How is it that how do you survive this long in life and not realize that you have to have a mechanism for evaluating what someone says to you? And if you find a couple of times where it's not true, then you have to start automatically discounting everything else they tell you until you can check with some other source.
Right.
Well, all things are well now, and apparently you're married for, going on 9 years, I guess.
Yeah, coming up on 5 years this next year. Yeah, coming up in 2019.
Excellent. And do you guys have any kids?
No kids.
No kids? You're not going to have a dozen kids and put them in the Mormon church?
It doesn't look that way.
Fair enough. But so, you had some struggles, you had some conflicts, you learned that things that you were told weren't necessarily true. Do you think that your life is better off being not Mormon than it was being Mormon?
It's one of those things, even knowing what I know now, there's no way you'd want to go back. I mean, trying to place a value on understanding what's true versus what's false is so important to me now, to understand the nature of reality so that I can make the best informed choices possible. To me, going back to that, it isn't something that entices me at all, because I wouldn't want to be making decisions in my life without all of the information or with false information in hand.
Well, I like it. We're going to wrap up on that. And James, thank you so much for coming on and I guess sharing your testimony on the Phil Ferguson Show.
Thanks so much, Phil. It was a pleasure.
This book, this is the first edition of The Origin of Species. And what is marvelous about it is that anybody can read any page and it makes absolute sense to them. It's not full of jargon. It's full of argument and observation. And that's another reason why I admire him so much. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. And that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved.
You're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show.
Of course, we're way over an hour again. My apologies. Maybe you don't care. Maybe you like the long shows. My fantasy is that I'll do this in about an hour's time, but it just doesn't seem to work out very often. And it's not going to get any better this week because I have several reviews, which I am delighted for. So maybe I shouldn't start that way, but I am delighted to have them. Thank you very much for sending them. It's something that you can do that really helps me out and helps the show out, because shows that have more reviews, shows that have more listens, perform better and are shown to more people. So in a way, you're helping expose more people to what I hope is good investment information, educational information about how investments work and what they are. Like today, we talked about target date funds. A lot of people probably won't know exactly how they work. So you're helping other people. And of course, the other side of me is that maybe someone comes in and listens for the financial stuff and finds the atheism and maybe thinks their way out of religion. Yes, that's part of my agenda. I absolutely want more and more people to leave religion. So maybe we can help one or both of those ways. And hopefully you can forgive my voice today. I'm finding a little bit of a Christmas cold. So reviews here on Stitcher. This is from, oh my gosh, Foxpire, I guess we'll go with that. Foxpire, about a week ago. I've been listening for years, and I'm one of those people who went back and listened to every single episode. My commute became much more intellectual. Oh, how sweet. Phil does an amazing job of explaining finance and gearing it towards the lay audience. With a few books, including Bogle's, this show has been a great introduction into handling my own finances and a great grounding in financial terms and concepts. The show is also a great way to keep a pulse on the atheist community, since Phil is both well-connected and an important advocate. Well, I'm not sure how connected or important I am, but thank you. I continue. I can't thank Phil enough for the education and his work in the atheist community. Thanks again for what you do. 2 thumbs up. Of course, a 5-star review. And then I went over to iTunes, and there's one's long, but the others are all short, but there's several of them here. So I'm just going to go into that. And I was thinking about skipping the beginning of this, but it cracked me up. So I'm going to read it to you. I am an Android user and detest everything Apple makes or does, but here I am on iTunes, which allowed me to install on my PC just so I could come and leave a review for Phil's podcast, the cleverly named The Phil Ferguson Show. I've been listening for a year or so after hearing him interviewed on another podcast. I really appreciate the mix of solid investment advice and compelling coverage of the atheist and non-secular issues. I really thought I was past the point where I needed to think too much about my investments, but Phil's advice has made me rethink and correct some long-held beliefs in that area. Be careful coming in as a theist. He might show you some things you need to rethink too. Now, we're talking about that. Phil, a suggestion: credit the interstitial bits. Little sound bites. When you play an excerpt from Sagan's Pale Blue Dot, I think you owe it to the author to credit it, if not verbally, at least in the show notes. That would also allow the user who does not recognize it to look it up and maybe explore it in depth. And just saying, and now Carl Sagan from a Pale Blue Dot would do the trick. End of the review. Some thoughts on that. Absolutely true and correct. And I maybe can do that in the show notes. The problem is I can't do it when I am mixing the show, because I do it in a very modular kind of way. So I have an interview, and sometimes I have several interviews stacked up in advance. And sometimes I'm desperate and I get an interview at the last minute, which is sometimes why the show comes out too late for some listeners. And the Investing Skeptically segment, sometimes I get a flurry where I do 2 or 3 of those. And I often do the very, very beginning and the very, very end really close to the editing point. But sometimes I don't. And sometimes I have all these pieces and I've got to put them together and mix them with all the intro music and the quotes in between. So I don't know at the time that I'm recording my audio of me talking what I'm going to put in between the segments. And sometimes I find new audio clips that I want to put in at the last minute also. So I won't be able to say it, but maybe I can put it in the notes. It's a really good idea. It just means more work for Phil, but there is merit to the idea that the people should get credit for it. I try to pick things that most people are going to know anyway. So I'll try to work on that. Another review here from TH9421. Great mix of investing and atheism. It's been entertaining for a long time. Thank you very much. Another one here from Des R. Damo. Phil is dropping all of his amazing knowledge on the truth about investing. There is no get-rich-quick scams here, covering evidence-based investing and what to avoid, pretty much everything else. Love the tone and the interviews. Oh, and he is a big supporter of the secular movement. Ticks all my boxes. Thanks for sharing, Damo. What was part of the title? Yay, thank you. Another 5-star review. A review from Nick Anderhoe. Nick Anderhoe. Best podcast ever with Thomas Westbrook. Thanks, Phil. Did enjoy that. And last one, DNuts26. Phil also lets you know that you should have what you should have done with your money. Also lets you know what you should have done with your money. Hopefully I let you know in advance what you should do with your money, but that's one of those weird things. I once had a talk scheduled at, funny enough, a Christian women's meeting where I was going to come in and talk about investing, and had talked to the committee members that were organizing the speakers, went over what I was going to cover. And a few weeks before the event, they contacted me and said that they were going to cancel my talk. And the funny thing is, it had nothing to do with the fact that I'm an atheist. It had to do with the fact that they were concerned that people who had not been doing what I would be suggesting would find out and learn that they were doing investments wrong, and that might be upsetting to some of their members, right? So I guess it goes with Christianity. You just don't want to learn from your mistakes. And I can see it being very difficult if you're 40 or 50 or 60 or older. If you find out, oh my God, all the investments I've been doing for the entire previous portion of my life, I've not been as good or as efficient as I could have been. I could see how that could be uncomfortable. I like to find out when I fuck something up, because I do, and then have a chance to fix it and make it better with the time that's allotted for me going forward. I don't want to blindly continue doing things wrong. So that's reviews. Mentioned earlier in the show, way back when, I do now have a Patreon page. After many, many requests over several years, you can go to patreon.com/Phil, Phil. Kept it really short for you. It's really easy to find, patreon.com/Phil, and you can contribute to the show. If you do, you will get versions of the show that do not have ads. This episode does not have ads, but I'm expecting to turn them on at some point in the future. I'm still working on the details, but you can get over there and support the show. It's a way for you to say, I see value in what I'm getting every week or two, and that I want more of it, and I want to help offset the time that Phil spends making this content. You don't have to, but it'd be really sweet. And I think I'm going to donate a big chunk of it from the beginning. I don't want to put any firm numbers on it, because maybe I want to take some of it and keep part of it. It's one of those things that I don't know yet. I've had some people ask. I don't have a good answer. So we'll see how that goes. Patreon.com/Phil. You can donate there. And I'm going to wrap up the show that's way too long. And I thank you. Thank you so much for listening. And I thank people who do support Patreon. I thank people who do write reviews. It is very, very Much appreciated. I'm just looking at iTunes here. There's currently 253 reviews, and only 8 of them are not 5-star reviews. So thank you very much. I'm very honored by that. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up, and I hope to see you out there at a conference or somewhere else sometime soon. Until then, ciao.